not only find decisions or choices hard to make, but many, of course, make the wrong choice. The story is told of a man named Fred who inherited $10 million. But in the will, it stated that he had to live either in Chile or in Brazil. He chose Brazil. Unhappily, it turned out that in Chile, the land that he would have inherited was full of uranium, gold, silver, and worth a fortune. But once in Brazil, he had to choose between receiving his inheritance in coffee or nuts. He chose nuts. Too bad the bottom fell out of the nut market, and wild coffee went on to an all-time high. He went out and he sold his gold watch for a flight home. It seemed that he had enough money for a ticket to either go to New York or Boston. He chose Boston. And when the plane for New York arrived, it was a brand new 747-400 series with champagne-popping flight attendants. The plane that arrived for Boston was an old worn-out Fokker Friendship that had seen better times, and it was filled with parents with crying babies. And then over the Andes, one of the engines failed. And so Fred made his way to the cockpit, and he said to the pilot, "Look, I'm a jinx on this plane. Let me get out, and if you want to save the passengers on this plane, give me a parachute." And the pilot agreed, but added, "Fred, on this flight, you have to have 2 parachutes." So Fred jumped out of the plane and he fell dizzily through the air. He tried to make up his mind which ripcord to pull. Finally, he pulled the one on the left, but it was rusty and the wire came loose and the parachute didn't open. So he pulled the other ripcord, and in desperation, the lines on the parachute became entangled. And then in desperation, Fred called out, "St. Francis, save me!" And a great hand from heaven reached down and seized Fred and let him dangle in midair. And then a gentle voice asked, "St. Francis Xavier or St. Francis of Assisi?" Well, in both of these biblical stories, the skin ailment referred to as leprosy is probably not the same as what was later known as leprosy or Hansen's disease as we know it today. It was named after the Norwegian scientist who in the 1870s isolated the bacteria that caused the illness. The Hebrew word zara'at, meaning ritually impure, was translated into the Greek as lepra, meaning rough and scaly. And then over time, this association between being ritually impure by way of skin lesions and the symptoms of Hansen's disease became inextricably intertwined. Because of the visible disabilities or deformities in which Hansen's disease can lead when untreated, fear of the disease, of course, was great. People with the disease tended to be treated in ways similar to those who were ritually unclean in biblical times. Today, some 4 million people worldwide are affected by Hansen's disease, with over 800,000 new cases detected each year. It is a disease of poverty and tends to spread in areas of malnutrition and overcrowding, being most prevalent, of course, in India, Brazil, Myanmar, and Indonesia. Our 2 texts then focus on stories of healing and the choices that were made by those who were unclean. In the story from the Jewish scriptures, we have the story of Nahum, a high-ranking officer in the Syrian army who is looking for a quick and easy cure for his leprosy. As we've noted, this disease renders him untouchable and unclean by others. Leprosy is no respecter of persons, and even the greatest of people can be made socially marginal and politically impotent by disease. Consequently, Nahum was desperate for a cure. He had been to every miracle worker and faith healer that he could find. And he even paid attention when a servant girl, a young Israelite girl whom he had captured in one of his military raids, told Naaman's wife that there was a prophet in Samaria who could cure his leprosy. The story then is full of irony. Naaman, who still thinks of himself as a great man despite his disease, sets off for Samaria with a whole entourage of horses and chariots and heads not to the home of God's prophet, but for the throne room of the king of Israel. And to ensure that he is not seen as a charity case by the king, Naaman arrives in full military splendour, loaded down with gold and silver and fine linens to present to the king. But the king has no power to heal him and is suspicious why a foreign military leader rocks up on his doorstep with all of these gifts in the first place. So when Elijah tells the king that he can help, the king handballs the problem to Elisha. A bit like when perhaps we go and see a GP or another health professional and they don't sort of give us the kind of help that we are looking for, so we're referred to another person who can help us. How important it is then to look in the right places for cures for our ailments in life. And so many people look in the wrong places. People turn to alcohol or drugs to self-medicate. They turn to radio jocks for advice. They follow reality TV shows to distract themselves from their troubles. They use Facebook, Twitter, or message to communicate with people for friendship and the alleviation from their loneliness. And some, of course, turn to the latest electronic gadgets to relieve the boredom of everyday life. Psychologists and counsellors are in the business, of course, of alleviating emotional suffering. Suffering arrives in our lives in innumerable guises: stress, anxiety, depression, behaviour problems, interpersonal conflict, confusion, despair, and grief. And some of our suffering is existential, such as sickness, old age, and facing death. And some suffering has a more personal aspect. The cause of our individual difficulties may include past conditioning, present circumstances, genetic predisposition, or any other number of interacting factors. And successful therapy then changes the patient's relationship to his or her particular form of suffering. Obviously, if we are less upset by events in our lives, then our suffering will decrease. That is why today, after this service, as you've heard, Ian will be able to present to us his take on what meditation is and how it can help us in our everyday lives. We can imagine then that Naaman had great expectations as he approaches Elisha's house. Perhaps this miracle worker will really cure me, he says. And perhaps Elisha could wave his hand over his leprous skin and restore it to health and wholeness. And in his mind's eye, perhaps Naaman could see himself riding back to Aram in his chariot with his head held high, his arms cleansed, his face exposed for all to see. And what a shock it must have been for Naaman to arrive at Elisha's house and to find himself greeted not by the prophet of God, but by one of Elisha's servants. And what a shock it must have been for Naaman to hear the instructions from the servant: go and wash in the Jordan River 7 times, and your flesh will be restored, and you shall be clean. So Naaman, of course, is not pleased. In fact, he is incredulous and scathing. What? Wash in the River Jordan? Why? If I'd been looking for a river to bathe in, I have got better rivers back in Syria. And for a third time in the story, it is a servant, a person of little power and prestige who prods the great military leader to do the healing thing. It is not always easy in life to do the simple things that can help us. We often seem to be overwhelmed by the big things, the great projects that we have, the huge demands that are required of us, that we forget the simple things. And maybe Nahum was expecting bright lights and bands to be playing, that the sky would probably fall in or the sun would stop when his healing occurred. Instead, he was asked to do something simple. We need to be reminded sometimes that in the hurts and disappointments in life, we can forget to do the simple things. Telling your wife, husband, partner, or children that you love them. Coming home with flowers occasionally. Saying thank you and thinking of others' needs sometimes before our own. So when we are physically injured or disease radically changes your life, when your heart breaks at the loss of a loved one, or injustice renders you incapacitated, and when your spirit is broken because you see no solution to an interminable problem, and all you can muster is the false confidence that comes from bolstering yourself up with false and hollow substitutes, it is then that we need to make the right choices for our healing to occur. And one of the choices we make is to access our spiritual resources in the process of healing. A few years ago, I read Dr. Larry Dossey's book. He's a surgeon, and he wrote this book called Recovering the Soul, a Scientific and Spiritual Search. He reminds us that there are very often medical situations and problems which can absolutely dumbfound medical opinion. He mentions this case of Sarah, whose removal of a gallbladder in her operation did not go according to plan. In the latter phase of Sarah's surgery, her heart suddenly stopped on the operating table. She was revived and on awakening had an extraordinary story to tell. She described in detail the consternation among the nurses and the surgeons, the operating theatre layout, and the surgeon's scribbles on the schedule board on the wall. She knew the colour of the sheet covering the operating table, and she talked about the hairstyle of the head nurse. She gave the names of the doctors who were sitting in the adjacent lounge room and mentioned that the anaesthesiologist was wearing unmatched socks. And during the whole time, she'd been anaesthetised. And what was so remarkable about this story of Sarah was that she'd been blind since birth. The divine spirit that we sometimes call God works not in quick fixes and cures, but sometimes in slow, messy cures. Not in instant recoveries, but in recoveries that come after repetitive dips in muddy waters. On God's healing, whether of the body or spirit, often comes not through the waving of some miracle worker's hand or an instant miraculous cure. We are people in our age who look for easy solutions, seek quick remedies from our GPs, or manufacture spiritual experiences like commercial commodities, and search endlessly for control over our lives and the events that shape them. Rather, God, the divine presence, has a way of working through messier mediums, a muddy, murky river, a small room where a therapist or counsellor helps us strip away our pretensions and our defences and illusions that we can heal ourselves, or sitting in a quiet place like Mingeri over here, where we can meditate and experience the presence of that which we call God, and calming, healing and peace can come over us. And sometimes we even come out of the muddy waters like Nahum did, with body and soul healed and whole. Our blessing. Divine presence, when world events seem to spin so fast that we are afraid of losing our foothold, and when the rate of change tosses us about like bull dust in a willy-willy, come to us, O Spirit of quietness, and gather us up into the great stillness of your unflappable love, joy and peace. Amen. Let's join in.